Hey, Pastor Jeff back with you. Thanks again for making the time to tune in and listen. Hopefully this is a valuable resource as we try to provide people's stories to make our stories better, to learn more about our denomination, our local church, but how we can get involved in the community, being followers of Jesus. And one now with a tremendous story is Russ Gunsalus. Russ, welcome in.
Thanks so much, Jeff. Really glad to be able to be here. And I love the way you say hearing other stories to make our story better. That's an awesome line.
Well, we're trying to do that. I think being teachable is one of the most important assets that we can exhibit, especially in this culture and climate. And so I just want to start right there with education and clergy development, where you provide leadership for the Wesleyan denomination. How important is it that pastors are teachable?
Oh, well, I think if especially as a holiness denomination, we have this presumption that God can make us better. And so if that's the case, we better be able to learn every day in every way throughout the entirety of our lives. So, yeah, I think being teachable and humble about it and embracing it, because sometimes we all know the lessons we learn are sometimes painful, I think is kind of core to really being a follower of Christ, becoming more like him.
And I feel as though vulnerability has kind of been a buzzword lately, which I think we need to be vulnerable. However, without accountability, sometimes it gets lost and we just kind of vomit proverbially on one another, and we're okay with it. But that accountability cleans it up. Can you just talk to me how you have learned to not only be vulnerable, but to allow people to point out your blind spots?
Of course, a challenging thing as well. It's not the top of one's favorite to do. This is like, how can I help someone point out the some of the rough stuff in my life? You hope to keep that posture towards God. But to be honest, because I know it's important, and I know back when I was teaching, you had these end of course evaluations, right? And a lot of times professors dread those just because nobody likes having everybody evaluate you. But I really got to the point where I really appreciated those a lot, because it really helped me see things that maybe I would never see or couldn't see. It helped me understand how people were seeing and experiencing me, so much so that I made up my own mid-course evaluation. I used to tell students, hey, you do this at the end of the semester, and that helps the next class, but it's not helping you. So we'll do it halfway through. There might be something that at least gives you a little extra bonus benefit during the last 8 weeks of the class, right? And so in that, I just tried to, in my own life, quite frankly, literally ask people that I consider trustworthy and wise, that know me well enough to be able to give me some insight. Hey, tell me, where's somewhere in my life that's a growth spot, right? And I call it a growth spot euphemistically. It could be something that I really need to knock out of my life, but just try to ask them to say, hey, is there something that I do or say or behave or in a way that I really should look at kind of developing in? And I found people very kind and very honest to help with that. And then, you try to do your best then to follow that insight into new and better you. But I'll do that regularly, and then I'll try to capitalize on what we all have, those kind of annual work evaluations, to make that a moment when, hey, what can I learn about myself and make me a better me for the sake of others and myself.
Yeah, I remember being at a youth camp, and the speaker said, you may not want to listen to me, and that's okay, but the person next to you might want to hear what God's going to say through me. So make sure that you are respectful of the message that they're trying to learn. How do you cultivate that within your own leadership? That some people might say, Russ, I know that, I have that, but there are others that they are definitely leading or impacting. How important is it that we walk humbly before our God, but certainly with those that are trying to provide leadership into our lives?
So are you asking like how you do that with those that are over you and responsible for you, or how you do that with people under your care?
Well, I'm speaking more for you, people under your care.
Okay, got you.
Yeah,
I think, well, one is, I think it helps to be able to tell that story, not because it's a story, but it's something I actually try to do, and also to give examples of it. I know one thing I do, because usually in a ministry role and you're working with other ministers, there's kind of a baseline of maturity and desire to at least become more like Christ, right? Yeah. And so there's kind of my current boss, Wayne Schmidt, our general superintendent, he talks about mutual accountability, And so because we're all servants of Christ, we have roles that we serve in that we need to function in. But as brothers and sisters in Christ, we really have a mutual accountability. So sometimes with those that are directly in my care, I'll ask them, what do they think are their growth areas? Usually we have a pretty good inkling. I might note a couple others that said, hey, this, you might think about this, but then I'll say, how about me? I mean, I know this is weird if I'm your boss and everything, but I'm honest. I would love to hear your perspective. Where might I grow for myself? And where might I grow in ways that would help you be a better you, more like Christ, as well as better at your work and things like that? So I think starting with myself, sometimes I'll do that. I hope, and I think that kind of de-escalates the usual awkwardness of having those conversations about, they're not confrontational, but that, and not rebuking really, but they're just like hard conversations, like the book titled Hard Conversations. I think that helps do that. And I try to do that. Takes a little of the awkwardness out of it and maybe normalizes a little. And then hopefully they'll embrace that kind of self-evaluation in their circles as well. And it spreads.
I think that's really good. And Russ Gunsalus makes some time. Wesleyan.org is where you can find more information. You're part of the executive cabinet. Now, I just want to back up. I am one of 2 local churches that are Wesleyan within the state of Vermont. Probably over half of those that attend our church do not really understand what a Wesleyan is. And even though I try to explain it, how would you explain what is a Wesleyan?
Well, if they don't know anything about, the history of Christianity, and they don't know about Methodism or anything like that, and our history like that, usually they just say, we're a bunch of people that love God, love each other, and try to help through the hope and holiness of Jesus Christ, transform ourselves, transform others, transform churches and communities. And so hopefully if they recognize we're serious about being loved by God and loving them and loving God, that's appealing enough to at least be curious to engage with it. So that's the kind of the basic one. So many people don't even know what churches really are sometimes. But if they know a little bit about churches, they say, well, we're kind of Wesleyan Methodists that left over slavery and then women's rights and equality and ministry. And we were teetotalers back then and prohibitionists. And so we were really reform minded, but we also had this element where we like to pursue God in a way that not only do we want to be rescued by God in salvation, but we want to be transformed by God into becoming more like him in holiness and becoming like Christ. So that would be my short pitch.
and that's why I'm a Wesleyan, and because we were against slavery and we were for women in ministry and shared leadership. One of the terms that you just used, that it used to be the big term that we always talked about, but it seems as though it's too intimidating now. That is the word holiness. Some people associate that with, you're saying you can be sinless and perfect, but what I would suggest is, no, we're just sold out for Jesus. But define that word holiness for that local audience.
Yeah, well, I tell you what, that is the language we use to describe the realities of the gospel is a tricky business. Some people have a whole different dictionary in their head when they hear certain words than we might have in ours, right? Yeah. So I probably actually might not even use that word, but the idea that if we want to become more like God, in what ways is God perfect and wonderful and loving? And so how are we going to become perfectly loving and wonderful to the best of our ability through the power of God working through us? So becoming like Christ is becoming holy. And I think that's the content of holiness, right? And so that's how I try to explain it for folks that aren't steeped in our literature and our particular tradition.
So a question that I have, the Executive Director of Education and Clergy Development, that's kind of a long title. With a lot of responsibility. I just look at the Wesleyan schools of higher institution, whether it's Kingswood, Indiana Wesleyan, Oklahoma Southern, or Houghton. I think I named all 5.
Yeah.
It's been a difficult time. How concerned are you about the institutions of higher learning within the Wesleyan denomination?
Well, quite frankly, I almost never use the word concerned as I do inspired by. Wow. If one of the things when I first began to go to the board meetings at those schools, and I'm on their boards, is I suspected it, and you hope for, but I was overwhelmed by the warm-hearted, passionate, focused kingdom building mindset of the boards. 2/3 of them are Wesleyan. Another third are folks like that aren't even in the Wesleyan church on our boards. And so it was an inspiration to me how clearly focused and committed they were to the gospel and also the beliefs and the message and the mission of the Wesleyan church. So that part, and the administrations as well. Our schools are filled with spirit-filled, serious, mature, wise Christians who have some amazing expertise in all kinds of fields because of the educational dynamic, who care about our students and the students that come to those schools. Most of them aren't Wesleyan, right? We hardly have enough Wesleyan teenagers to pack them all out, though we should try, Wesleyan churches that are listening. But they do this unbelievable amplification of the discipleship that happened in the home inside of those schools, through the spiritual formation and the chapels and the spiritual lives of the professors. And so oftentimes we forget, and we'll hear about some controversy or something a student does, as if what some random 19-year-old does depicts everything, or we won't like how somebody handles something or the way they said it. And we'll forget that the reality is maybe they stumbled in their rhetoric, maybe they made a mistake in a management moment, but forgetting these are die-hard committed Christians who are passionate for Christ and the kingdom and building the kingdom via the Wesleyan church. So there's challenges economically. Higher ed's a tough space to be in. But when it comes to mission, all of our presidents, all of our boards, and their commitment to Christ and to the mission is really, it's inspiring. It's just unbelievable. And so that's what our schools are like, and we're lucky to have them.
Yeah, and Russ, thank you for sharing that. And I know for me, there was 93 through 97 at the time, Bethany Bible College, which it was small enough that I got that focus that I needed, but it was nurturing where I could just grow in my own faith or foundation, so I could just share out of that experience something that was legitimate and authentic. And I'm so grateful. My son is 19, and some of the choices he has made, we're just like, I'm glad we can't base everything he does on our family name. My daughter's 17, and she's considering Indiana Wesleyan as one of her options in a year or two. So when I look at this title, Education and Clergy Development, I do think of higher institution learning. Clergy development, I just wonder, what does that mean in a nutshell? Do you take people from candidates for vocational ministry through the ordination process, or what all does that encapsulate?
Yeah, it has a little more than it has in the past. In 2012, it used to be education and ministry. And so it's the education and then kind of the credentialing aspect. And they added clergy development because of a sense of also bringing clergy care and development to the picture, right? And so in that space, there's like an overlap in the education. There's ministry education and there's higher education. There's some overlap there, obviously. But we help facilitate, empower, and partner with district boards of ministerial development and local churches for when a person feels called in a new era, a new chapter, a new level of their discipleship into ministry, and all kinds of ministry. What do they need to do to be able to be equipped for a ministry credential all the way to ordination? So we really participate with them in that on the credentialing side. And then also I've been partnering with districts and churches across North America to develop clergy care resources, practices, and engagement. And so like the gathering that we all have and participate in every 4 years, that's really turned towards the well-being, the thriving, and the building the capacity of our clergy and the resilience, and a lot of other programs to do that as well. So, a lot of time ministers will preach about the abundant life, but sometimes because we like helping people so much, we forget that it's for us too, right? And so helping ministers embrace that as well for themselves and for the sake of their families and their churches too, because letting God do that work in you and help you be whole and healthy and thriving is good for you, obviously, but it's great for your family and your church too. So that's what we try to help foster, facilitate, and resource the best that we can.
Yeah, it's amazing how many pastors do not have a Sabbath or exhibit that day of rest.
Yeah, we did a year of Sabbath emphasis a couple years ago because of that. It's like the fourth commandment. It's a big old fat commandment right in the middle, and we'd never dream of breaking the others, and that one we get a little sketchy on. So, yep, exactly.
Hey Russ, we spoke off air about Lloyd and Rhonda Moore and Lloyd's
Yes.
passing, and it's just so difficult. And can you just talk, because Lloyd and Rhonda Moore were part of the standard denomination that merged with the
Oh yeah.
Wesleyans, which is the same as the local church that I pastor.
Yeah.
But just seeing Rhonda's resilience and strength. I know cancer and death isn't new to anyone, but seeing somebody exhibit just the strength and knowledge of who God is. Could you just talk to that a little bit?
Yeah, I tell you, watching how Lloyd lived and also how he died. You think of Wesley looking at the Moravians when they thought the ship was going down. He lived like that. But Rhonda's presence and faith and strength through that, clearly pain and hurt and loss that she felt, and we shared in with her all around. But she was such a woman of faith and living out Christ in her life that even in her pain, she was always a blessing. And in that, even I think she's continues to move into new arenas and new areas of ministry expansion for herself. And I don't know how much of that exactly is born of the fruit of the seeds of the pain of some of the things they went through, as well as what God's calling her to. But yeah, she's a great example, I think, of she would have been one of the Moravians in that ship, right? That would have been so inspiring how she faced the prospect of death, or in this case, the death of her husband, with faith and perseverance and pain, but showing us all how that God goes with us and we can still reflect Christ in the middle of some of the worst situations of our lives.
And Russ Gunsalus graciously spending some time with us on Instagram. It's russ.gonzalez on Instagram, russ.gonzalez. But Russ, when I think about clergy care this past year, though different in a lot of ways than what Rhonda experienced, there has been a sense of isolation, loneliness, and tremendous loss. How have you seen that within your position, and how do you think the denomination and pastors can really resource and let one another know that we do care and we are not alone?
Yeah, I especially the alone factor. I mean, historically research talks about how isolating ministry can be, because sometimes when you're seen with a collar on, even if you don't wear one, right, it has a little bit of a distancing dynamic.
Yeah.
And then to have a literal distancing dynamic, especially I know there's some pastors that are kind of introverts. They're great preachers and introverts, but being with the people is not always their favorite thing. But so many pastors are such introverts that not having live three-dimensional human beings there in front of you in the congregation really was difficult. And then, of course, so many people not only lost family and friends in the pandemic, but they're caring for a church at a weird distance, and their congregation is losing family and friends, right, in different ways. And so I think it created an immense additional load on our clergy that I think pushed a lot of us more deeply into trusting Christ and leaning on God in ways that maybe we should have been doing already, but it made it so acute that it was like, okay, God, clearly I'm not figuring this out, and apparently nobody else is, so help, and God helped in that. And but by the same token, important to realize, I said this season it's been snowball stress. It just keeps collecting on the snowball.
Yeah.
So we've been trying to encourage pastors and congregations to help their pastors. Make sure you take your Sabbath. Make sure you take your vacation days. Maybe plan some extra time off for your own strength and resilience in the middle of the storm. At the start of this, I wrote a little piece that had the article from, the image from Rembrandt of Christ on the Sea of Galilee, and all the disciples, so some were pulling ropes, some were puking over the side, some were doing this. There's a few of them sitting back at the boat, even though the waves are crashing, just hanging out and listening to Jesus. And boy, was it a time in the storm that became really, for me, poignant. It's like, all else, regardless of the waves, I need to be hanging out and spending time with Jesus even more clearly, intentionally, and kind of continually than before. And I think that was a common experience, punctuated by unbelievable ministry moments, right?
Right. Yeah.
I hear so many of those that happen too. Giving, expanded ministry. I know one little church that had about 75 to 100 people in it in Southern Indiana. He set up a really, kind of what you're doing, a really sweet production studio, started preaching. And he had over 1,000 people tuning in regularly from all over the world for his services, even though he had locally church about 100. So, there's so many stories like that of ministry expansion and God doing his work, which we know he does, regardless of what the waves are like. So that's probably a long answer to a short question, but that's some of the stuff I experienced and saw happening, and thoughts about how we've been working through it.
And that's so encouraging. And I know for our local church, we're about that same size, 75 to 100. And we had our best financial giving year that we've ever experienced. And we had to go, everything was online because we were renting a middle school. And so when the pandemic hit in Vermont, it's pretty strict. But we've just been able to utilize technology. And I know for me, I was or am one of those extroverts that I need to talk and meet with people because I just love learning and hearing stories. And so now we do it via camera instead of over a dinner table. But
exactly.
Russ, when I think about who you are, the position you have, quite frankly, I was a little bit intimidated with the thought of interviewing you. But then I was reminded that we all have a story of how God raises us up or when we became a Christian. Could you just share that story of when you became a Christian?
Yeah, absolutely. I was really blessed to get to grow up in a Christian home. My dad was a minister and worked in Christian higher ed. My mom worked in Christian ministry for a good chunk of her life and is just a wonderful lover of God, And so, I grew up in the water that I swam in was all of that. But my earliest recollection was, it turns out I was probably 4 years old for my parents' say, because I was at a camp. I remember this sawdusty kind of floor stuff or a tent thing in the summer camp in Michigan. And I remember hearing something about hell and bad stuff about it. And I remember thinking as a little kid, like, well, I don't want to do that. I like Jesus. And I remember going to the altar as kind of fire insurance, And, but too, growing up in a family like that, just increasingly God reveals himself in more and more. And I remember early in my teens having that feeling like, okay, am I in or am I not? Right. I'm really in. And I remember just saying, yeah, I'm in. And then God punctuated it again with the kind of clarity. And my freshman year of college, like, hey, would you work for me in our business in the church here and be a minister? And yes. And so God has always been so faithful to tap my shoulder, and he's always loved me so diligently and so faithfully and so generously, way beyond anything I could ever imagine or deserve. And every turn, to the degree that I embrace it and then make the turns with him, he just takes me on these unbelievable adventures in the kingdom, things, people I get to be with and meet, and places I get to go, and the things that I get to do for the kingdom. Never would have imagined, from the simplest things of when you get to perform a wedding, right? There's a groom and a bride, and you're right there. You get to be in it, right? You get to be in baptisms, but then the other things beyond it that you get to do, and it's just like, just embracing God's love for you and his plan for you, and doing your best to listen to and follow it is just an unbelievable adventure. So I just am overly blessed.
Yeah, it certainly is an adventure, and one that I'm so glad that we can hide and abide in who Jesus is during this storm, during this time. When I think about the denomination, and perhaps I say this jokingly, but turn in my credentials because I think it's still the same, but how Dr. Schmidt said he wants to be known or have us known more as a movement than a denomination.
Yeah.
How important is that? How does that look for the Wesleyan denomination to be seen, viewed, and used as a movement of God?
Yeah. Well, I've heard some people say that denominations have never turned into movements. They don't see evidence of that. I think there is some, but I always like to say, hey, Wesley was an Anglican to the end. And that seemed like a pretty good movement he was part of, right? And so I think, the obvious piece is, how do we collectively listen to God, follow his leading, and move where he's moving, right? So that's a prerequisite, right, for us to be able to kind of be that kind of kingdom expanding movement. But then I think beyond that, it's being open-handed and generous. What we learn and do share with everybody that we can, other ministries, other denominations, just be open-handed and generous. And I think that is has a multiplying attractive force in spirit, so to speak. But then also just be attentional about it and actually, count things. Like, who are the people that we are engaging with and moving in them on the discipleship path, right? How are we doing that with people personally and professionally and through churches, right? Are we asking those people how God's leading them into ministry in the marketplace or into the pulpit or to wherever God's calling?
Right.
And I think just being faithful to actually keep moving intentionally in those relationships, redemptive relationships, with actual questions and actual encouragement and actual equipping to do the works of the church and the kingdom. So that spirit, and then getting real intentional about how we engage, equip, and mobilize people, which is, in my opinion, a lot of what's happening and a lot of what Dr. Schmidt's engaging us in. And so it's making disciples.
That's so good. I apologize if this is a old screen, but I think it'll get the point across. With Wesley Seminary, why did the denomination choose to begin its own seminary? I think it's extremely valuable. However, I have been told maybe I should go back and pursue some more education. And so I kind of balk at that because, well, anyway, I do. But Wesley Seminary, can you just talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. There was this interesting moment in the Wesleyan Church and in the life of Indiana Wesleyan that had where a conversation was about another seminary possibly coming and being part of the school and providing the seminary kind of ministry education at the graduate level. And in that conversation, it became clear, and some of your listeners will know this name, Keith Jury. He said, well, you only have one seminary card to play, so let's make sure we play the right one, right? Because you only do it once, so you don't start over. And it was really just a collection of, at that time, and the people and the resources and feeling a leading. And there had been a couple other attempts and considerations of doing that. And it was just like, as a time such as this, I think God was helping encourage, equip, and empower us to dive in and approach the subject and look at it. And so the strength and vibrancy of Indiana Wesleyan at the time, and the resources that were there, administratively, et cetera, really gave the space. And Henry Smith helped give that green light as the president then, for a number of us there at the time, with folks all across the denomination, to think about, conceive of what would be the best way to equip ministers in that next level now, right? And so we really had a real advantage of not having to change something that had been there for decades. Start with a clean slate and keep focused on the missional aspect, equipping of pastors for local churches, and also in a way that kept people in their context. So I think that, and integrating the curriculum into the ministry practice that the persons were involved in, really helped, so that not everybody can move and go somewhere for 3-4 years to do a Master's of Divinity. And that let us be in a space where we could offer MDiv. It was like go to seminary, take your church with you, and you don't have to move, right? And so a lot of those factors built together, and the kind of the context and season of seminaries around the country just gave us a great opportunity. And God just blessed like crazy. You know, Wayne Schmidt was the first head of the seminary, now Colleen Durr, and they've just did unbelievable things and have grown that fledgling seminary into one of the leading seminaries in the country, really. So it was quite a watching God do that from a close-up seat was fun to see. So.
Well, Russ, we thank you so much for making the time. We have
I think I froze.
Russ, I think you're still there. My internet kind of glitched out.
I can hear you. I can hear you.
So I apologize, but a couple more questions. Good. Couple questions, then we'll get you out. And I did. The Wesleyan Church in New England is pretty strong. Or I'm sorry, the Nazarene Church in New England is pretty strong. Has there been any conversation about the Wesleyans and Nazarenes working together for some of those institutions of higher learning?
Not a lot of real formal kind of discussions. There's a lot of camaraderie between the faculties and different leaders in higher ed from those institutions. They're structured a little different. The Nazarene schools are kind of connected to a cluster of districts around them, and ours are, they have regions, but they're tied to the whole denomination. And ours fortunately are spread out geographically in a way that they don't have to be on top of each other. But those other schools they're kind of warm-hearted colleagues. They're our kingdom-kissing cousins, so to speak. And but there's really not been a lot of talk about kind of mergers. Now it's in a new season in higher ed across the board, all higher ed. It's a difficult time, and so out of necessity, sometimes those conversations emerge. But hopefully we can at least partner together to keep building the kingdom through higher ed, even in all of our spaces for both denominations. So
that's good. Russ, and just a couple personal questions, hopefully not too personal, but local church, what has it been like for you to attend a local church? Have you been in person, or when did you go back to in-person church?
Yeah, just I go to College Wesleyan Church in Marion, and they were following kind of the guidelines, so there's some of those moments where we're together, and then cases went up, and so then we went back to online. So it's been I'm fortunate to have a really great preacher in Steve DeNeff as my pastor. So going online and watching him is still a treat. But just of the last few, a couple months now that it's been open full, where we could get back in and together. And so that, again, I'm an extrovert, if you couldn't tell. That's been nice to see everybody again. And it's, it's kind of a old family reunion moment when you get in there together. Because even if you're online at church, you're obviously not online with everybody in the pew with you, right? So it's not like it's a 500-person Zoom meeting. So that's been great. That's kind of been our journey, like a lot of churches, open, closed, open. Okay, now we're really open. So the vaccinations have been a big blessing in that front.
They certainly have. Russ Gunsalus, the Executive Director for Education and Clergy Development with the Wesleyan denomination, wesleyan.org. And I just need to ask you, I feel I need to ask you, your personal spiritual disciplines, does it begin with waking up early? When do you find that time or make that time to have that consistent pattern of behavior?
Yeah, I'll tell you, my entire life, my greatest asset in my kind of personal devotional life is persistence more than consistency. Right? I remember hearing, and I remember once wanted to write a book called "Stop Doing Daily Devotions and Save Your Soul." And that sometimes it's, now I talk to God, quite frankly, I feel like I'm talking to him all the time, right? And I pray as much as I can and as much as God leads me to. And I read the scriptures and have cool devotional things on the apps, but I cycle through stuff. So I don't know if this is bad or helping some of you out there that have this personality, but I'll have a season where I'll use a particular book or particular tool or particular app. I really, with the proliferation of spiritual formation apps and things you can listen to, that has been kind of my go-to place. But I'm really more, I'm touching in with God every day and talking to him as much as I can. But I have these chunks during the week where I'm able to spend more focused, specific time studying, thinking, listening to God. And I find a lot more now, my times of exercise and walking and being in nature is real heavy duty conversation with God time as well. So I'm never going to quit trying to figure out ways to better connect with God and learn more about him. But I am one that's eclectic, and I have been that way my whole life. And I finally resigned myself to that a couple decades ago. It's like, okay, I'll just keep trying more and better different things, and they all seem to help. So that's kind of how I do it.
I like that a lot. It's actually kind of freeing for me to hear that you can just find Jesus where he's at. You don't have to stick to that method every single day. But Russ Gunsalus, wesleyan.org, the Education and Clergy Development Executive Director. Final question I have for you, Russ, is simply, when so many people want to go back how things were before the pandemic, what pause do you give and what suggestions would you have for those to say, we can go back a certain way, but we need to learn from this experience so we can reach out to other people?
Yeah. I think the entire history of Christianity has been always capitalizing on trials and tribulation for new ways to spread the gospel, to bring Christ to folks, to bring the good news to the world. Whether you think of Paul, shipwrecks and beatings and everything else. everything turned into something that was a new opportunity. And then even in the history of the church and the world, Christians have always been on the forefront of capitalizing on new innovations. Think about the printing press, and also innovating in new ministries in the face of trauma and struggles.
Yeah.
From the early days during the plague in Rome, right, when the Christians stayed and helped people,
Right,
and
right.
therefore saved a lot of lives just by giving water and care, right? That's traumatic. But doing that, being Christ in the moments, regardless of what's going on around, that's what we're about, and that's how we operate. And so when thinking of going back in the church, it's like, I don't think you can ever think about going back. It's a forward focused faith.
Yeah.
To becoming like Christ until we all get there together to be with Christ and keep becoming like him. So capitalize. I mean, what you're doing right now, and what so many people turn to instant. All of a sudden, I'm a TV preacher, right? And don't abandon that. Embrace that, and move forward and do more of that, and do more of what you can do locally and together. And I just think it gives us an opportunity to not only overcome obstacles, but in overcoming them, we've created whole new opportunities to reach people. And because of this day and age and the nature of the internet and technology, to reach more and more people in more and more places than we maybe ever have before. So I'm optimistic for it. I think don't even look back unless it's just to take good notes on what you learned, and then let's keep plowing ahead.
So good. A privilege and honor to have a conversation with you. And if I might, can I call on you to pray for us here in Vermont? Reverend Joel Tate of Frisbrook Wesleyan Church and myself here in Waterbury Center. Won't you just pray for us as we seek to reach the lost, but by living lives changed because of who Jesus is?
Absolutely. Lord, thank you so much for your presence in our lives and in our relationship and in our moment here together, even through technology. And for Jeff and Joel, as they lead congregations for our corner of the kingdom and our branch of your kingdom, Lord, we just ask that your spirit continues to pour out on them in the ways that invigorate them personally, that they feel like new men and new leaders and new ministers every day in a myriad of different ways. Give them comfort when they need them, give it strength when they need it, give them wisdom and discernment. Bless them and their families and those that are around them in their congregations. And Lord, let their burden be light and their ministry with you be a joy, and that as they faithfully go through things and tackle things that can be tough, that they're fruitful and that they're adventurous in the joy that they bring. And so I just ask that you continue to support, care for, love, and connect them as you have for so many years, and move through them in special ways that reaches the state of Vermont and beyond. Open the hearts of the people around them to hear about you, and let them get to see that fruit and enjoy that work with you and for you in totally new and imaginative ways in the months and years ahead. We thank you for loving us first and most and last, and for loving Jeff and Joel up there in Vermont, and just ask that you continue to bless them and bless us as we follow you. Amen.
Russ, thank you so much. We'll talk to you again soon.
Thank you, Jeff. My pleasure.